Early electronic composers envisioned a time where you, as the composer, would have complete control over every aspect of music, the creation of the timbre and also the performance. In 1955, the scientists at RCA, Harry Olson and Herbert Villar, realized to a certain degree that dream of those early composers in the creation of the RCA synthesizer. In any case, it was called a synthesizer, and it did do synthesis, stacking frequencies atop each other to design timbre. And that's what the RCA did. But it didn't do it with the giant cogs that the telharmonium used, or even the tone wheels that the Hammond organ used, but rather with tube oscillators. In fact, the Mark II had 24 tube oscillators. It also had tube-based filters, tube-based amplifiers, and tube-based LFO that it worked with. So it really did have the components that we associate with the modern synthesizer, which is pretty fantastic. But what you wouldn't expect was that this device, although containing an analog synthesizer, was actually a digital device. Now, of course, it wasn't computer controlled, but it was digitally controlled. This digital control came in the form of punch tape, which the composer would use to define every single aspect of what the synthesizer was doing, including its timbre, how that timbre was realized, what notes were played when, the articulation of those notes, even things like portamento, which it also possessed. All of those things were defined by holes carefully punched in paper tape. There was even a console where you typed this information in, and it was quite meticulous. So the entirety of the synthesizer was controlled by this tape input, which is a digital sort of input, which separates it from sort of our notion of the synthesizer. But what was really cool about it was that it was essentially a giant sequencer, a very powerful sequencer. Of course, it was only monophonic. It could only perform one line at a time. So a system was built into it in order to account for this. And how this system worked, it's really quite incredible. You won't believe it. It had a system of record-making devices. The part that you had typed in initially would be performed, and it would be self-recorded on a lacquer disc by the RCA synthesizer. The RCA synthesizer would actually make the record right there. And it had this system of recording onto records that it understood and allowed for synchronization. So it would play a number of different parts onto one lacquer disc, and then it would record those parts onto another lacquer disc on one track, as opposed to the multiple tracks that existed on the first lacquer disc. And then you'd start with a new lacquer disc. It would record more new tracks, and those tracks would be bounced down to another track on the lacquer disc over here, which is just absolutely astounding for a number of reasons. First of all, it was cutting records right then and there. Second of all, the system was designed so that all this would be synchronized. So these multiple performances that were not recorded on a computer were actually etched into a disc, were still synchronized with each other as they were recorded, as the recordings were multi-tracked and bounced. They all stayed in synchronization, which is absolutely astounding for that time. So essentially, your sequencer had lots of tracks, but they all had to be recorded and bounced down onto lacquer discs. I heard somewhere that it could do up to 216 tracks, which is just unimaginable for a device working in this fashion. So, several different professors at Columbia were interested in this RCA device. Obviously, anyone interested in composition in the 1950s was probably going to be pretty curious about this thing. So, these composers, essentially Vladimir Ussachevsky, Milton Babbitt, Otto Luning, got together and they approached the Rockefeller Foundation and said, please, will you buy this for us? And the Rockefeller Foundation said yes. And so this gigantic room-sized synthesizer, tube-based, was installed at the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center and used by a variety of composers. It was interesting because a lot of the literature at the time sort of in a promotional sense, was talking about how the composer now had complete control over all of the aspects of creation. It was used in a variety of compositions, those by Milton Babbitt, well, a number of composers, but Milton Babbitt is well known for his recordings with this device. And for years, it was used to create music. At some point, it was actually damaged in a burglary and has never been fully functional since, which is a bit sad. But in any case, you can see the importance of this device because it realized the dreams of these early composers and visionaries about what electronic music could be and where it was going. And as we know now, that's exactly where it was going.